Introduction to React State. So today we're going to look at the fundamental concept of React that allows our components to be dynamic and interactive. And this concept is known as state. So you can think of state as a component's memory. And this state enables it to remember things like what a user has typed into a form, which image is currently being displayed in a carousel, or what items are in a shopping cart. Understanding component state. So at its core, React is about building reusable components that manage their own content, presentation, and behavior. In order for these components to be interactive, they need to react to user inputs and server responses and other potential dynamic events. And this is where state comes into play. And state allows components to remember certain pieces of information between renders, therefore makes it possible to create dynamic and interactive user interfaces. Let's think about the case where we don't have state. Then all our components would be static and unable to respond to changes, basically rendering them ineffective for most modern web applications needs. Introducing the useState hook. So one of the primary ways to manage state in the React components is through the useState hook. Hooks, you may be familiar or not familiar. So hooks is something that is introduced in React 16.8, and it allows functional components to hook into React features like state and lifecycle methods, and which were previously only available in class components. So this one of the hooks called useState hook, what it does is it lets us add the React state to functional components with ease. So when we declare a state variable using useState, we get two pieces of information. First is the current state, and the second is a function to update it. So on the next slide, we're gonna see how we can apply this to a practical example. Here is an example counter component. So we have a counter component. It's a functional component. And we can see that this counter component returns this HTML, which contains div and the paragraph that has count. And there's a button and that says increment, and there's on click and on click handler increment that calls set count. So this is the part where we're using useState hook. So in order to use useState hook, you need to import useState from React, and then when you call useState, you want to provide the initial value of your state, and then this useState will return two things, as we discussed: current state, which is count, and a function to update it, which is set count. Here is another example, text input. So we have text input component where we return HTML input, and this has value input, and on change is going to update the text value. So in order to provide state, we're importing useState from React and setting the initial value of text state to be empty string, and this returns the current state and a function to update. Another one, toggle visibility. We have toggle visibility component, and we are importing useState from React, and we're setting the initial value of the state to be true, and this returns the state is visible, which is true to begin with, and we have this updating function that can update this state. Adding a state variable with the useState. So you can think of recipe gallery component displaying a list of recipes, and if you want to say update the displayed recipes when the next button is clicked, you might initially try to use a regular variable to track the current index, but this approach has limitations. It's because regular variables in React, they don't persist between renders and don't trigger re-renders when changed. So by replacing the index variable with a state variable using useState, you can preserve its value across renders, but also inform React when it's time to re-render the component based on the updated state. So here is another example. We are importing useState from React, and we are setting the initial value of the state to be empty string, and this state, we're naming it to be name, and we have function to update this state name, and then we have this form. Upon change in the input, it's going to change the state variable's value. Therefore, it's going to trigger re-render, and this paragraph will be updated to reflect the new name value. Anatomy of useState. So when we call useState, we are basically telling React, here's something I want you to remember, and we pass the initial state of this function, which returns an array containing the current state value and a function to update it. So this setup provides the foundation for building interactive components. So the ability to update state and have React automatically re-render the component with the new data allows for a seamless user experience. It is important to remember that state variables should be named in a way that reflects their purpose and that they are always updated using the setter function provided by useState. Here's another example, user info. So you can see that we are importing useState from React. This time, I guess the different thing is we're setting the initial state value to be an object that contains both name and age. And then we have two input HTML component, and on input change is going to, for the first one is going to update user's name, and for the second one is going to update user's age. Managing multiple state variables. So our components often need to remember multiple pieces of information, and React makes it straightforward to introduce additional state variables as needed. Each call to use state defines a new state variable, allowing us to track different pieces of data independently. So we have this flexibility, which is powerful, but it is really important to consider how these pieces of state relate to each other. So if you happen to find yourself updating multiple state variables in tandem, it might be more efficient to combine them into a single state object. This approach can simplify state management and make your components easier to maintain. Here is an example of a user profile. This is very similar to user info we saw, but we are creating two separate states for name and for email. So for the first input, it's just going to change name. For the second input, it's going to change email. State is local and private. So this is a key characteristic of React State, because React emphasizes in encapsulation. So state is local to the component it's defined in. What does that mean? This means that if you have multiple instances of the same component, each instance maintains its own independent state. And this isolation ensures that components are self-contained and predictable, which is essential for building complex applications. Moreover, state is private to its component and cannot be accessed or modified directly by other components. So this encapsulation reinforces the principles of component-based architecture, promoting reusable, composable, and maintainable code. Here's an example of two independent counters. So we have this app component. This app component has two counter components. So if we look at counter component basically use state, starts the count from 0, and whenever the button is clicked, it's going to increment count by 1. And we have two counters, which means we have two buttons to increment. And if you actually try running this, you will see that the state value of the first counter and the second counter are independent to each other. That means clicking increment of the first counter wouldn't increment the second counter's state value. Recap and best practices. So to wrap up, remember that state is a powerful tool for creating dynamic and interactive React application. Don't forget about useStateHook, because useStateHook simplifies state management in functional components. One other thing that you want to keep in mind is whenever you name your state variables, You want to name them clearly and also manage state efficiently. So that way you can create efficient, scalable, and maintainable React applications. Thank you everyone for listening.